My name is Kurt Volker. I have the honor of serving as the director of the McCain Institute, and I'm proud to be introducing you yet again to one of our series of debates about foreign policy and the choices that we face as a country. We're fortunate. We're anticipating Senator McCain will be joining us a little bit later this evening, but we're going to get ahead with starting the debate as it is right now. As you heard in this video, we aim to create an environment that is nonpartisan, that is getting to the substance of issues and the choices that our country faces. And this is going to be the case in our discussion tonight about Cuba, as it has been on others that we've had on Afghanistan or Iran and so forth. It is being videotaped, so we'll have this available online immediately afterwards. We'd love for you to participate in Twitter, the hashtag #MIDebateCuba. So please go ahead and put your cell phones to vibrate, but feel free to take part in the Twitter discussion going on simultaneously with the debate. There will be an opportunity for questions from the audience, so be thinking about that as well. And please frame them as questions so that we really get the most out of our debaters that are here. If you want to learn more about the McCain Institute, please visit our website, mccaininstitute.org. With that, the topic here is chosen because of some of the decisions that have recently come out of the U.S. government about re-engaging or opening diplomatic relations with Cuba. And we wanted to have a debate that focused on the merits or the criticism of that decision and what comes next. In order to lead us through this, we have a terrific moderator. He is the White House correspondent for Fox News Radio. He previously worked with Sirius XM. He has some personal ties to Arizona. And I'll bring him to the podium and let him introduce our debaters. Please welcome John Decker.
Thank you, Ambassador Volker, for asking me to moderate tonight's debate. Thank you to the McCain Institute and Arizona State University, and thank you in advance to Senator McCain, who, as Ambassador Volker said, will be here a little bit later. He's just coming off the Senate floor. And thank you to our audience, of course, tonight. We hope that tonight's debate informs you as our panelists discuss this major change in U.S.-Cuba relations. The topic of tonight's debate is particularly timely, and for me it's also personal, having covered U.S.-Cuba relations starting more than 20 years ago for NBC television and radio, and I continue to cover this issue. In fact, tomorrow I'll report on the second round of diplomatic talks between the U.S. and Cuba taking place here in Washington. But it's important to remember the events that led us to today. In late December, the President announced the most sweeping shift in U.S. policy toward Cuba in more than half a century. He called the move to reestablish diplomatic relations a new chapter for the two countries. The decision by the President followed the release of American aid worker Alan Gross, who spent more than 4 years in prison in Cuba on spying charges, and 3 Cuban agents serving time in the U.S. were essentially swapped for Alan Gross. In explaining his decision, the President made a point of reminding those of us in the White House press corps who were covering his remarks that America has had relations with communist-ruled China for more than 35 years and re-engaged with Vietnam nearly 2 decades ago, and he said the time to open talks with Cuba was long overdue. Highlights of the new U.S. policy include further relaxing travel restrictions to Cuba, increasing remittance levels, expanding exports from the U.S. to Cuba, and reviewing Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. As you'll hear in tonight's debate, there are many criticisms of this policy. The chief complaint is that the Obama administration failed to get more concessions, if any concessions, from Cuba, and failed to put specific goals in place to improve human rights on the island. But the President has argued that the policy that was in place for more than 5 decades hasn't worked. And now's the time, he said, to try something new to push Cuba toward democracy. We have an impressive panel of experts assembled tonight to discuss these issues, and let me introduce them to you. Our first group of debate panelists is on my near left. Julia Swag is Senior Research Fellow at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of several award-winning books on U.S.-Cuban relations. And Jody Bond is Vice President of the Americas for the International Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Our second debate team consists of Mauricio Claver Caron. He's Executive Director of the Cuba Democracy Advocates. And our second debater on that team is Orlando Pardo, a visiting fellow at Brown University who lectures about social activism in Cuba. Let me explain, if you haven't been here before, the format for tonight's debate. It's pretty straightforward. Each team will open their arguments with 4 minutes. Following that, each team that gets 2 minutes to respond to the other's opening argument. I will then move things a little bit further along with a few questions in which the teams will get 2 minutes to respond. And after that, that's when you in the audience get to get involved and ask your own questions. Again, each side has up to 2 minutes to reply. You'll notice a clock right here. Our panelists should pay attention to this clock up here. If you don't, I'll make you aware of that clock up there and remind you that your time is up upon answering your questions. And finally, at the end of the debate, I will go to each of our panelists and ask them in 1 minute to sum up what he or she believes the U.S. should do right now as a matter of U.S. policy toward Cuba. So why don't we get things started with a first question to our group here, to our far left, Julia and Jody. This is a question that's been asked by many critics of what the president decided to do, and that is this. Doesn't the president's executive action simply provide Cuba with a fresh source of desperately needed hard currency and eliminate any U.S. leverage for political reforms on the island?
Well, thank you very much, John, for that question, for moderating. Thanks to Ambassador Volker and to all of you for coming tonight, and to my colleagues here on the panel. We're here tonight to assess the merits of the policy initiative the President just announced in December. To my mind, and this will get to your question, and we will over the course of the debate, there are 3 major compelling factors that support this move. First, on the foreign policy grounds, the United States has increasingly lost ground and standing in Latin America over the last 10, 15 years. And increasingly, as the politics in that region have moved quite substantially and foreign policy has become quite a bit more autonomous, our relationship with Cuba has become a stigma. It has become a symbol for Latin Americans, right, left, and center, of whether or not the United States really is prepared for what the president has called a 21st century partnership. Taking the Cuba issue off the table puts the United States, both in terms of Venezuela, in terms of Brazil, in terms of our entire standing in the region, in a much better position to talk real issues and cooperate deeply with Latin American partners. Number 2, on straight national interest grounds, the United States has a strong national interest in setting aside 50 years of a policy that has isolated the United States from being a positive actor on the island in Cuba. Cuba is on the verge of a very significant change. We are 3 years away from being in a post-Castro environment. The United States needs to participate in a positive way on the ground. This will help. And that brings me to the question of the Cuban people, who will be invoked many times tonight. We live 90 miles away from one another. There are 1.2 million at least Cuban Americans, people of Cuban descent, living in our country. These organic ties of family, of business, of history, it is unnatural for us to have this separation. Getting us started with a new sense of engagement and participation in Cuba's future is what we are now beginning to see just begin.
Okay. Jody.
Thank you very much, and thank you, John. Thank you, Ambassador Volker. Thank you to the panelists. It's so nice to be here. And, of course, thank you, Senator McCain, for arriving just in time. All right. So I do have to take 30 seconds, though, to indicate that last year I was the recipient of a McCain Institute Fellow, and one of my favorite and best fellows that we've had working on North American issues. So thank you. I'm glad to be here, and Julia pretty much summarized some of the foreign policy arguments and why we believe that engagement was timely now. But from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, let me just step back and say that there are 2 considerations that guide how we view this. The first is that while the sanctions were well-intentioned, they ended up not having the effect that they were intended to have. And as Tom Donahue would say, anybody who goes into business and has done the same thing over and over for 50 years without the same result would have been out of business a long time ago. Unilateral sanctions are not something that we support, and the Chamber has not supported the embargo for quite some time. Conversely, my second point is we believe in engagement. 95% of our customers live overseas, and we have conversations with governments that allow us to talk about free enterprise. There has not been an opportunity in the past until now to actually have a conversation with the Cuban government about training entrepreneurs and those in free enterprise. So in those two lights, this was actually a positive step from the Chamber's viewpoint.
Mauricio.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. And as I see here how we're seated, I'm glad I wore my best socks without any holes in them, so I wouldn't embarrass myself
I know.
in that regard. So I'm feeling very grateful. First and foremost, from a U.S. interest perspective, let's realize that this didn't begin on December 17th of 2014. This began on December 3rd of 2009 when the Castro regime took an American hostage, Alan Gross, who was in Cuba helping the Jewish community. For taking this hostage, what the Castro regime wanted was a series of concessions, wanted the release of 5 imprisoned spies that were here, including one that was serving a life sentence for conspiracy to murder 3 Americans, and a host of sanctions lifted, including taking Cuba off the state-sponsored terrorism list. We've now done that. Any time that the United States policy is dictated by coercion from a foreign dictatorship, the United States automatically lost. And I think that that is a big problem here. In addition to, we've lost hemispherically because in 2001 we have the Inter-American Democratic Charter. 34 out of 35 countries in this hemisphere are democratic with one exception. To now say that we're going to have business as usual with the dictatorship, with a dictatorship in this hemisphere, again, after this tremendous democratic progress in the hemisphere, we're opening the door to the authoritarian ambitions of many closet dictators, that some not so closet in Venezuela and elsewhere, that are going to continue to degrade the democratic institutions in those countries. In regards to the other losers here is the Cuban people. And the Cuban people have lost because essentially the president negotiated with Raul Castro nothing for them. Yes, there was this release of 53 political prisoners, many of whom, over a dozen of whom, have now since been rearrested. And since December 17th, let me highlight this, since December 17th of 2014, there have been over 600 political arrests in Cuba. Now you do the math. 600 minus 53. Not much progress there. It's a net loss. So therefore, the Cuban people have already lost politically. In regards to trade, we've also lost because the Cuban regime is a monopoly. So therefore, we're now allowing further trade with a monopoly, which is a company owned by Fidel and Raul Castro called Allenport. And in regards to travel, we want to open up in order for a tourism industry, which is owned by the Cuban military through a conglomerate called Gaesa, which, by the way, is, according to Hotels Magazine, the largest hotel conglomerate in all of Latin America. Therefore, a loser for U.S. interests, a loser for the Cuban people, an obvious win for the Castro regime.
Orlando?
Yes, thank you for being here. I will read in order to be as fast as possible. 50-plus years of U.S. diplomatic stalemate and economic sanctions have failed to bring freedom to the Cuban people because they were not designed to bring freedom to the Cuban people, but to penalize a regime that started by sequestering Cuban sovereignty by violent and anti-democratic procedures. The 50-plus years to come of U.S. diplomatic relations and capitalist engagement with Cuba can neither guarantee the advance of fundamental freedoms in my country because a market economy is not per se a redemptive formula and has been already implemented by many authoritarian systems as a tool for more tyrannical control. U.S. democracy seems guilty of the duty to foster democracy worldwide, but Castroism has been more than proud to castrify democratic countries. Venezuela is the most tragic example today, as the recently liberated 5 Cuban spies in the U.S. have declared when ordered as national heroes back on Cuba. We are ready to do the wrong thing again if we are ordered so by the commander-in-chief. Sic semper tyrannis. Did Cuba win? Cuba cannot win because perpetuation in power is always a failure and the best approach to endure a fossil past, despite the faith in the future expressed by Nancy Pelosi. The U.S. executive branch enforces resolution after resolution involving exclusively those congressmen and NGOs and think tanks and press magnates and corporation tycoons that hurry to shake Raul Castro's hand without asking him a single uncomfortable question, thus legitimizing he who abolished the Cuban Congress and the Cuban Chamber of Commerce and Cuban think tanks and Cuban NGOs, as well as the exercise of free press. By the way, convenient Cuban dissidents are also called into play, not by the rule of law, but by the rule of loyalty. The rationale seems to be that, as it is impossible by now to hold the Cuban government accountable, the appeasement of the dictatorship into a dictatorcracy is the lesser evil. Mentioning Cuban society, civil society only for political correctness in speeches, while in fact excluding Cuban civil society from the new status quo. Just to end, maybe this is a small step for democracy, but it could also be a giant leap against independency or decency. The Cuban policy of the US is the ironic victory of the end of history. From our war against Spain to the anti-imperialistic revolution of 1959, the growing common marketization of international relations is what really counts. That's why, for the first time in our hemisphere, it's a communist country where the cry of Yankees, come home, echoes now. So you are more than welcome to try to fool our tired tyrant with US dollars, but as a Cuban intellectual, it's my duty not to renounce to my skepticism. Thank you.
Julia, Jody, you have 2 minutes to respond to those remarks.
Say anything I mean, I think I'd like to just go back pragmatically. I want to just go back to what this looks like for the United States and how the United States is viewed by taking these actions. For starters, we've built up one of the most dense networks of free trade agreements in this hemisphere. The contrast is already apparent. The countries that have free trade agreements with the United States fared the economic crisis better than those that did not. Several of these countries are also in a failed state. But many of these countries are ones that we should be looking at trading with. We have got to look outside our own market to our customers. And I think that by taking this action, or not taking action prior, the United States had been looked at poorly by many of these countries, by many of our customers. It also, the sanctions were used as a tool in this hemisphere for indicating why the Cuban people were suffering, why there was scarcity, why they couldn't feed the people. It was the fact of the matter that they were using the excuse, and this basically lifts the veil. And we've had a very positive response from many of the countries, many of our allies, and our other trading partners, friends and foe around the world.
And I'll jump in here and say, I just came back from Cuba a few weeks ago and have been traveling there frequently for the last 25 years in various different capacities. And so I've gotten to know the national security mentality and the state of siege mentality that has pervaded that country. And what I've seen now is there's a real sense of the air coming out of the balloon. There's a sense of opportunity. There's a sense that we can put the battle with the adrenaline intensity of the battle with the United States to the side and build a future that perhaps means both governments getting out of the way a little bit and allowing the societies of the two countries to connect. And on the last point, you know, I think there's a caricature that is very pervasive in the United States, that in Cuba we have dissidents and the government and nothing in between. In fact, that couldn't be more far from the truth. We talk about Cuban society, not just the dissidents and not just the government, of groups who are producing art and literature and who are women's groups and gay groups and environmental groups. And, you know, one can smirk at that and find it hard to believe, but this is a fluid moment in Cuba, and this opportunity to remove the object of politicization, which has been the United States, I think we must walk through that door now, lest we become increasingly irrelevant in just a few years.
Mauricio and Orlando, do you see that type of environment existing right now the way it's been described by the other debate team?
Yeah, well, I mean, democracy is brought about by leaders. In the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, when Charter 77, began with 50 to 100 people, and it became a movement, and then people followed that leadership. Today, Cuba's democracy movement, and a lot of Czech leaders during that time that were part of that movement will tell you, is much greater than it ever was in the Czech Republic in the 70s and 80s. Therefore, we have to embrace that political leadership. Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, those were political leaders. They weren't economic leaders. They weren't people that were trying to set up a little small business shop. They were the people that were game changers. We have to embrace those game changers. But Jody makes a very important point that I'd like to stress here, because it's the only talking point the administration has, that somehow by doing this and embracing Castro's regime and flooding it with dollars, we're somehow going to bring the rest of the hemisphere in order to support the Cuban people. It's another one of this Obama lead from behind things. So we're going to lead from behind, and therefore now the rest of the hemisphere, since we're doing the same thing they're doing, they're now going to support Cuba. But we have the case of Venezuela. In Venezuela, this week, a 14-year-old was shot in the head and murdered. The mayor of Caracas was taken out of office. By the way, all of this after Maduro, the president of Venezuela, went to consult in Havana, went straight back and began this huge intensified repression there. Where's the rest of the hemisphere? Where's Mexico? Where's Brazil? Where are those people that the Obama administration says that are now supposed to join us in condemning Castro's regime? They're not opening their mouth for Venezuela. Why would they do so for Cuba? That's a fallacy. I would like to believe that, and I'll let Orlando, my time. Let me pass the baton, so I don't ramble.
Okay, as the pro-democracy leader Oswaldo Payá stated many times until he was extrajudicially executed in Cuba in July 22nd, 2012, why not the recognition of all of our rights now? This seems to be a wicked word, both for President Obama, for General Castro, and maybe even for His Holiness the Pope Francis. Rights. What is good for Americans since the 18th century is still not good for Cubans in the context of the violent Latin America in the 21st century. Why not the effective solidarity? And yes, opening or closing, but the international pressure, the international community pressure, so that the legal claims that have already mobilized tens of thousands of Cubans be respected by our non-elected authorities. Why not to take advantage of this negotiation or this engagement to sit in the same table, the historical gerontocracy, with the civil leaders of our free future, instead of having apartheid breakfast between Roberta Jacobson and this leader in a separate date and room, after we have risked so much to conquer freedom of speech and to raise awareness on human rights violation and the overall anthropological damage that right now there is in Cuba. So I had the feeling of missing an opportunity, and what cannot be done by USA and Cuban engagement right now in this moment will never be done, because the agenda will be dictated by the government of Havana. It's like a perception.
Let me ask a question before we get to the point that you may have wanted to bring up, Jody, in that, but let me ask this group a question, Jody and Juliet. President Obama has said that normalizing relations will allow the U.S. to be more effective in promoting political change in Cuba. But why should we believe that will occur in Cuba when it is contrary to U.S. experience with communist regimes such as Vietnam, where normalization has led to no improvements on human rights, in fact, none really, in the past 2 decades?
Do you want to start on Vietnam, or do you want me to?
I was going to say that I think it has been emphasized, and I would emphasize it too, that we're a little bit on shaky ground to suggest that normal relations equals political democracy. That is, I think, a false setup, and we should disaggregate that entirely. Orlando's talking about the Cuban people making change themselves. What normal relations will do is take the United States out of the picture so that people that want change in Cuba, reformers on the island, dissidents, members of civil society, can have a conversation with and against, if they choose, the government that doesn't involve having to prove where they stand on the matter of U.S. policy. This has been very counterproductive to the internal debate in Cuba for some time, to have the United States as the Goliath and Cuba as the David. Political change in Cuba, however, unlike the Vietnam case, I think, we can't speculate. However, the proximity with the United States and the integration at the organic level of our economies, of Cuban families, that is becoming increasingly deep, does have political consequences, will have political consequences down the road in Cuba.
Can I address that, John? Julia said something which is somewhat concerning to me in this regards. In 2003, in the spring of 2003, there was something called the Black Spring, where over 100 dissidents and then 75 got condemned to over 15 years in prison for signing what was called the Proyecto Varela, which essentially was a petition according to Cuba's constitution, to the Castro regime's own constitution, that if over 10,000 signatures were put together, they would have to have a referendum, they would have to bring it up to the National Assembly. That has nothing to do with U.S. policy. Those individuals spent over a decade in prison because of asking, according to Cuba's own constitution, for their freedom and their human rights. Too many people have suffered and spent decades in prison because of simply asking their government to be able to have open freedoms, open labor unions, etc. And I think there's an important point here, and I want to go to your question with Vietnam, because I think it's very important. Cuba today is a politically, economically, and socially bankrupt dictatorship. What is so bad about that? Why do we now want to make it into a Vietnam or a China, which now China is the most lucrative dictatorship in human history? Why do we want to do that? Why is that a good thing? Why is this concept of state capitalism, which 70 years ago was called fascism, now now it's more PC to call it state capitalism. Why is this whole concept of state capitalism now acceptable? Why should the United States in this hemisphere be promoting this concept of state capitalism, of having a dictatorship, have complete totalitarian political and economic and social control over someone, and yet have a little bit of a facade of economic freedom? That's an insult. The Chinese model, the Vietnamese model, the Burmese model, whereby once we opened up relations and lifted sanctions, have regressed politically, that model does not belong in a hemisphere where 34 out of 35 countries are democracies. We're risking going backwards instead of forwards. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Maybe to answer in less than a minute to Mauricio, I think there are at least two reasons. The supposed stability in the region. Cuba is somehow handling violence, is handling the bad guys. They know how to deal with the guerrillas, with the authoritarian regimes in Venezuela. They know the drug trafficking and the human trafficking. Cuba can take care of that as long as the government is strong. Never mind if it is a dictatorship or a dictatorcracy. But we need stability, as the USA needs stability in the region. And they are willing to pay the price. Democracy can wait like heaven. And well, that would be a serious equation. Now we are in the side of being stable, of behaving. No, in the paternalistic model of the Cuban state somehow, maybe in the geopolitical context, implies that now we need to behave a little longer. And ultimately, yes, after the Castro, but it's not so sure, because we have Alejandro Castro Espín, which is a colonel for the Ministry of the Interior. He is giving conferences. He's going to taking the presidential investment of other presidents, and he's behaving already as the dynastic successor, and we need to take that into consideration. Maybe we will have 2.0 Castros and 3.0 Castros.
Let me come back, if I could, to this team right over here, Mauricio and Orlando. Why, in your view, would the resumption of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Cuba not have immediate benefits? Wouldn't it enable the two sides to better coordinate drug interdiction, for instance, or immigration matters?
Well, coordinating drug interdictions with a regime who still has senior officials indicted in the United States for drug trafficking sounds kind of counterproductive in that regard. The fact that there is now a Venezuelan official, the former Hugo Chavez's bodyguard, who is now in New York testifying, is now cooperating with the DEA and U.S. prosecutors in regards to the narco-trafficking activities of the Venezuelan regime, and he has mentioned that it involves Cuba as well. So a country with that track record, a country that last year was caught lying to the international community, that trafficked 240 tons of weapons to North Korea, the only country in the Western Hemisphere ever to be found in violation of international sanctions. The worst violation of those sanctions in history, since those sanctions have taken place, that lied to the UN experts. I recommend everybody read that UN report. They lied to the UN experts, and therefore these are trustworthy partners that we're going to want to deal with. Once again, we should embrace the good guys, not the bad guys. There's a bad habit that this administration have of cajoling the bad guys and kind of setting the good guys aside. That's not what America's all about, in my view.
Yes, please.
Before that,
Respond to that.
let me just start with a baseline that I think I was so excited Senator McCain arrived, all the star power, that I forgot the baseline we should start with, which are a couple of facts. First, in no way does our position on the sanctions or on the new regulations somehow indicate that we don't believe that this one-party state or the Castro regime has not, over time, committed atrocities. Absolutely, it's a given. What we see, however, is there has not been the opportunity until now to actually have a lucid conversation about what are some of the constructive steps that we can take to promote free enterprise in Cuba. It's not a question either or. The operative word is and. Support for those dissidents and train some of those employees who, through the new investment laws that were passed in Cuba 2 years ago, took 600,000 people off the government payroll. Train those people how to start up their own enterprises, how to control their own economic destiny. In these discussions with the Cubans, what's new and different is they have asked us to use our expertise how to train those individuals not on the government payroll, how to start up their own businesses. And one thing that we know for certain is where we promote free enterprise, have the opportunity for engagement on the ground, the opportunity to have our businesses be the ambassadors for America, promoting free enterprise, economic opportunities will result, and that's a win for the Cuban people.
Jody, actually, that brings me to my next question, and it goes to you and Julia. The Cuban government bars private ownership. It limits and monitors private communication. What gives you optimism that this new U.S. policy shift toward Cuba will lead Cuba to change its policy and give its citizens more freedom?
Well, first of all, what we're starting to see in Cuba over the last few years is the state pulling back from controlling all property. In the last 5 years, upwards of, I believe, 500,000 licenses have been given for Cubans to start their own small businesses. Residential real estate has been privatized, and Cubans, if you go there, you will see, are in fact have real estate agencies and are buying and selling their properties and other properties. And Cuban Americans are, without calling it investing by acquiring properties, helping their families to do so, helping invest in small businesses and capital property accumulation, something that is something that, you know, is as American as mom and apple pie, to your question of what kind of influence. So training of the kind that Jody is talking about, investment, capacity building, contact between our business community and Cuba's nascent business community is just kind of the basic building blocks of influence. That's what we talk about doing all around the world, and Cuba is absolutely ripe for that. Does that equal political change tomorrow? I'll repeat what I already said. No, it does not. But it begins to reinforce a process on the ground of autonomous spaces that up until very recently did not exist.
Mauricio?
So there's this concept that we have to go teach the Cuban people how to be entrepreneurs. You know, John, you spent time in Miami. A Cuban arrives in Miami and within a week has built a business and a shop. What Cubans need in order to build a business and be entrepreneurs is the freedom to do so. Cubans are natural entrepreneurs. And before this whole perverted concept, because it's a perverted concept of self-employment, cuentapropismo, because these independent entrepreneurs that they call them, these 500,000 that they're referring to, don't have a business. They don't have articles in corporation. They're not allowed to have wealth accumulation. They don't own the property. They have a license, permission from the state to work in property owned by the state and keep a little bit of the money off the top. Now, what we're doing by normalizing that is we're normalizing that perverted system, in lieu of the black market, which is where they operated before. I wish Cuba was Costa Rica. I really do. But Cuba is not Costa Rica. And the fact is, we already know what's going to happen if we lift sanctions. In 2000, when the Trade Sanctions Reform Act was passed, it was said that when we start selling all these agricultural products to Cuba, that was going to change. It was going to bring this entrepreneurialism, etc. Since 2000, the United States has sold $4 billion worth of agricultural products to Cuba for cash in advance, thanks to good members of Congress that didn't want to get ripped off by Castro. That's been done by 250 American companies, have sold over $4 billion. There's only been one Cuban counterpart, a company called Alimport, owned by Fidel and Raul Castro. Where are the Cuban people? Article 18 of the Cuban Constitution says all foreign trade in Cuba is the exclusive domain of the state. The Cuban people have absolutely no stake in that game. Until that changes, you change that, you're going to see entrepreneurialism in Cuba. It's not that we need to go teach them entrepreneurialism. It's not that we need spring breakers to go teach, people that have spent 20 years in prison as political prisoners about democratic ideals. They can tell us a lot about the ideals that we take for granted. Go tell that to the hundreds of thousands of people buried in the Florida Straits. I get passionate, so I'm going to flip over to
I know. It's okay.
Let me actually stay with the team of Orlando and Mauricio, and let me ask you a question. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. and Cuba agreed to what is known as the wet foot, dry foot policy for Cubans seeking exile in the U.S. And under the policy, Cubans interdicted at sea by the Coast Guard are returned to Cuba. Those who manage to make it to the land, likely in Florida, are permitted to remain in the U.S. Why is the usefulness of that policy, or how is that useful as a policy anymore? And why should Cuban immigrants be granted this special immigration status right now? Please.
No, I cannot answer the usefulness of that policy. That's a question to ask to the U.S. government. But I can tell you that there is like a national wisdom in the Cuban people after all this apparently engagement, because the Cuban government may be stepping back, depends of how they feel safe or not, or how they feel that this approach can imply a democratization. They will be stepping back because it's their nature not to be democratized by democracy. But I can tell you that there are record numbers of rafters, illegal human trafficking through the Mexican border, and Cuban Spaniards, those that obtain the passport because of the historical memory law of Madrid, Spain, that are coming from Europe in record numbers to get the Cuban Adjustment Act, adjustment of status before it disappears or is inhabilitated, despite the statements of the U.S. government and despite whatever the Congress is saying. There is like a wisdom, and this is what I call the pedestrian plebiscite. In good economical conditions, in hopeful, full of hope conditions that this moment could imply for Cuba, we are still saying to the Castro, no. We are economical migrants? Maybe. But I call that a pedestrian plebiscite, as a sole plebiscite for me is political.
Mauricio, do you want to weigh in on that particular question?
I mean, the one fact that we've seen since the President's announcement on December 17th is that the number of Cubans that have been leaving by raft, that have been risking their lives, that have contributed to the hundreds of thousands that have died, that is that tragic national cemetery that is the Florida Straits, of people seeking freedom, has increased dramatically. It's increased dramatically. So this whole concept, there's this new hope in the Cuban people. Unfortunately, it's a hope to emigrate. The saddest news that we have, there's a saying in Cuba, what do you want to be for kids? What do you want to be when you grow up? They want to be an immigrant. They want to leave the island. That's a tragic national reality. And what we need to do, and why do they want to come to the United States? Well, which goes to a fascinating point here. Everyone says, oh man, when I go to Cuba, the Cuban people, they love Americans. They love us. They love Americans. They want. Yes, because we've been on their side. Go to Eastern Europe today. Eastern Europeans love Americans. They join us in all our efforts throughout the world. Why? Because throughout the Cold War, there's a psychological reality. They perceived that we were on our side. Now change that dynamic and embrace that totalitarian regime and have that be the image of Americans. Have the image of Americans be like these Canadian tourists that go down to these military resorts to engage in all kinds of nasty activities, or like these European tourists that go down there and don't have no disregard for dissidents and for the Cuban people. And watch how quickly their perception of Americans change. They love Americans because the perception is we've been on their side. And we need to remain on their side. And by embracing that regime, we're going to do long-term damage to that, in my opinion.
I want to give an opportunity for our audience to ask our panelists some questions, and hopefully you have some well-thought-out questions. This gentleman right over here at the bottom.
Quick question to two ladies. Just as the mic. Just a moment, the mic's going to come your way right now.
Could you say who you are? He called us.
Oscar Gonzalez. I live in.
Wait till you have the microphone, sir.
My name is Oscar. Is it on?
Hi, Oscar.
Hi, Oscar Gonzalez. I'm actually a Cuban American, but I was surprised you said you've been to Cuba like for the last 20 years, and I'm not sure if you've been,
Yes.
but
Yes.
interestingly, in terms of the policy changes and just to make it, I think, real, how are the folks really going to behave differently? And let me just, for a lot of folks here who may not know, do you know what the CDR is? There's like a person on every block who's watching everybody else. That is going to continue. So I don't see how the policy change is going to impact at a very real level folks on the ground. So I think the debate is, have we lost? I mean, Cuba said, yeah, the answer is yes. So I mean, I'm rambling, but I don't know if you want to address the real personal issue of how these folks, like this guy a couple of years ago, he got his ass handed to him because he spoke up over there. And that's not changing right now. I mean, Mauricio mentioned a number of folks who are still being incarcerated and having lots of problems. So, I mean, how do you square away?
Julia, Jody, why don't you
Well, I
take
hope that does change. But, I mean, we are looking at a basic question of foreign policy. What is it that the United States has in its foreign policy toolbox? I will insist on telling you that over the years that I've been there, I have seen and been in many ways able to see very close up exactly the kind of activity that you're describing. And we don't know. The answer is we don't know whether by removing the threat of the enemy, that sort of thing will dissipate. But we need to try. We need to try to be positive participants there. John asked a question about, why would the government start to get out of the way? Will it start to be less intrusive, less oppressive of its citizens? And the answer is we don't know. But what I do know is that already in the last few years, when contact takes place, what you see is a space that's opening that the government actually can't control. And you ought to go. You ought to go and experience and see it.
I was there 2 years ago, and I only went back because I wasn't sure. I was afraid to be welcomed back as a comrade. But as long as you're followers, they treat you okay. But
Right.
the other point is the state controls everything. I have a cousin that was running this little coffee shop, and she didn't own whatever, getting taxed like 40% or whatever little meager money she was making. Yeah. So this entrepreneurial stuff, I mean, maybe to you guys is collateral damage. If you're, from the homeland, it just brings it home, and you can't divorce the personal issues with policy. I mean, they're very connected to somebody like me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Someone else. This gentleman right over here in the middle. Bring a microphone over to him.
I have a question, I guess, for everybody in the panel. It's been said that for the first time there's going to be a dialogue, conversation with Cuba. That's simply not true. The United States has been having a diplomatic mission in Cuba, which is the largest diplomatic mission. There are more Americans than there are Canadians or Frenchmen or whatever in Cuba since 1977. It's not for lack of American diplomacy or diplomats that we have a problem. My question simply is for Julia, for example. What is the difference between the new policy that you applaud, that the President has announced, and the old policy that the Europeans and the Canadians and everybody else has had? The policy that the President wants is millions of tourists, The Canadians, the Europeans have sent millions of tourists to Cuba. The new policy of the president means that you have unrestricted trade and commerce. The Europeans have had that for more than 50 years. The president wants to have full diplomatic relations with all the Europeans and so on. The president wants to look the other way about terrorism. The Europeans don't say anything about terrorism. So what is the difference between the new policy as announced by the president and the old failed policy of engagement with Cuba? Now, maybe another policy will be needed, and what I would say is to condition everything. If Raul Castro wants to get some of the things that he just got, he ought to remove his troops from Venezuela. If Raul Castro wants to have better relations with the United States, Raul Castro should say, no more Russian bases in Cuba, no more Russian spy ships in Cuba.
Thank you, sir. So let me pick it up here. What about this idea of getting more concessions from the Cuban government in terms of getting a further examination of U.S. diplomatic relations with the United States?
Look, just to remind the audience, the embargo is still in place. There is no legal basis for allowing American tourism a la Canada to the United States. The regulatory changes the executive branch has made have not eliminated the ban on trade and investment. Can't without Congress. So let's be proportionate about what has happened. There's a little bit more of, we don't allow investment, we allow microfinance and some remittances and some people-to-people and other broader travel, not tourism. We have that intersection that you're talking about that might become an embassy soon. Most of its staff is sitting there to process visas for people that are coming here for the lottery every year of 20 to 25,000 people that come here, and to deal with the flow back and forth. But you can hardly say we have had a policy of engagement. Now, on this matter of, and one other quick point, with Vietnam we have, I think now, 23 to 25 different bilateral dialogues on all kinds of issues. We have one or two or three with Cuba at the moment. What foreign policy and diplomacy is connecting at the government level and obviously at the non-governmental level. On the concession issue, you know, that concession argument has been used for the last 55 years. If we just keep the pressure on, we will get the Cuban regime to make these concessions. It hasn't happened once. We need to start a different tack at this incredibly fluid moment in Cuban history when we are 3 years away from a post-Castro regime.
And toward that point, you know, Julia makes a very good point that I don't think that folks understand how fluid things have been on the island. And Raul Castro has indicated he's going to retire. He's indicated he was going to pass a new investment law. He indicated he was going to have a dialogue with the United States. There have been certain issues that have been tackled in a different way. And toward that, the level of negotiations wasn't sufficient for the United States to have the dialogue it needed to have. There's a dialogue. This is a proximity issue. It's a neighborhood issue. There's environmental remediation talks occurring. There is search and rescue discussions that are underway. There is narco-trafficking discussions that are underway. The level that those are occurring at, those need to be elevated. This is shared space that we need to have a better set of discussions. Why does the business community care? Because it's important that we have some means of environmental remediation should there be a spill.
Sir.
That's why you care.
Sir.
So why do we care? The fact of the matter is there's an opportunity to do business with some of these incredible entrepreneurs, and although they may have been stifled for quite some time, I have been there, I have met with students, there's a spirit that's there that we can go in and for the first time, again, the embargo is not lifted. This is simply allowing the opportunity for us to go work with some Cuban entrepreneurs who are not on the government payroll and to be able to help do some training with them as well as to look at opportunities for telecommunications build-out and the World Wide Web for Cubans to actually come out with something here. This has been the first opening to do that.
What about that, Mauricio?
I'm kind of fascinated by this whole kind of minimizing what the president's announcement is, because let's be clear, regardless of the fact that all trade with Cuba goes to these monopolies and that the tourism goes to these militaries, the chamber is lobbying for lifting all of the embargo and lifting all the travel. So let's you know, despite all of that, despite the fact that that American business would not be able to hire Cubans directly, that it would have to be done through a state entity, and the Cuban government pockets over 92% of all of that. So let's minimize that in context here, which I think is very important. But I think, first and foremost, who we're missing out of this whole picture, we're talking, you know, environmental dialogue and counter-narcotics and all these things. The only people that are being left out of this dialogue, and Rosa Maria Payá, the daughter of slain pro-democracy leader Osvaldo Payá, has always said it, you know, part of it, this is a conversation amongst elites. It was 18 months of secret negotiations in Toronto and Ottawa by the Castros and then Obama and his envoys. Where are the Cuban people? U.S. law simply says we will lift our sanctions and allow, you know, unfettered trade, travel, etc. with Cuba on essentially three basic conditions: the unconditional release of all political prisoners, the liberalization of political parties, and the recognition of fundamental rights and independent press and labor unions. Now, some people want to change that. Which of those conditions do you disagree with that we want to essentially do away with that in order to engage this monopolistic dictatorship? I think it's a dangerous message to send to the Cuban people. We're picking the wrong sides in this debate by doing that.
Very briefly, I think there is no wrong side in this because totalitarian the characteristic of totalitarianism is there is no wrong or right side. There is no left or right. This is simply a monolithic system. You take it as it is. You accept the agenda of the totalitarian system and you move forward, or you keep the stagnation. In any case, the solution for my people seems to be not the best. Only to mention that during these 2 years of secret negotiation, the confidence building of the Cuban government, they didn't behave. They were smuggling weapons under tons of sugar in a ship through the Canal of Panama, risking God knows how many lives. There were, of course, the arrest of dissidents, the beating, and the message that no tolerance will be allowed, or that the system is not reformable. This is in the public speech. And besides, what I am worried also about is the humiliation that U.S. administration can receive from the Cuban government. One example, that Roberta Jacobson is elected in an elected position in the United States, needs to trade or needs to talk with former Cuban diplomats that were expelled from the United States because they were spying in connection with spies that were in the Pentagon, like Maria Belén Montes and others, the WASP. So I'm worried that the good efforts and the goodwill of the American people and the representatives of the American people at some point could topple, or could be humiliated, by the nature of a government where there is no right or wrong side. I reckon that stagnation might not be the solution. Opening to the Cuban government might not be the solution. So that's why I feel skepticism in my people, while others are having another vision. No?
Mm-hmm. Do we have another question? Yes, you, ma'am, right here. Yes, thank you.
My question is most relevant.
Do you want to just wait until we get a microphone to you so that everybody can hear you? Thank you.
It's coming from behind you.
Hi, my question is the most relevant for Ms. Bond. How involved is the Chamber of Commerce with the Casas Particulars initiative? I'm sorry, I was studying it for my research project, but...
Oh, okay, you're doing a study. So,
bed and breakfast.
Yeah, we have not been involved specifically, so there hasn't been an opening for us to be involved.
Let me address that, because I think this is really important. You know, one of the issues here that we need to be very careful of, if we unilaterally lift all sanctions and allow everything to be funneled through Cuba's monopolies, what we're allowing is the Castro regime essentially to parcel out, the goods. Well, what's going to happen there tomorrow? then tomorrow we're going to see these Russian-style mafias with these former Ministry of the Interior officials who are running all the key industries in Cuba. That's the last thing we want to do in that regards. Right now, a lot of these paladares that people talk about, the most famous paladares in Cuba, the ones that have the most resources that are built, oh, these are private restaurants. Yeah, but guess what? They're owned by the son or the grandson of the Minister of the Interior, of General so-and-so, of Colonel so-and-so, etc. And then Raul Castro dines at some of these paladares. You really think they're independently owned? No, they're owned by elites. Some of them. There are a lot of them.
Okay.
Wait, hang on. The nicest paladares, the ones that have all the resources, everybody knows, and Orlando, correct me if I'm wrong, and I could be wrong, but the ones with most of the resources, everybody knows it's because you have a connection to the Ministry of the Interior, the Minfar, or someone in the regime in order to be able to have those fancy paladares. Now, there are people that are trying in their homes to put a counter and surviving and struggling. And guess what? They don't even own that. They don't even have that privilege. That's the disparity that the danger that we're going to be doing by unilaterally lifting sanctions and essentially giving that monopolistic decision-making to just the regime.
Julia, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond. You wanted to get in there.
I mean, the kind of sweeping global picture that Mauricio paints, in my experience, isn't the case. But you asked the question about the Casas Particulars. That's the bed and breakfast network that has been operating in a very nascent form in Cuba since the 1990s and has grown quite significantly since, in which people are allowed to rent out rooms to visitors or to other Cubans in their apartments and homes and make money. Now, interestingly, when I first was not when I was first in Cuba, but while doing my dissertation research in Cuba, my husband and my then 18-month-old daughter and I did that. And we did it in Havana. And this was the time when Cubans had no tolerance whatsoever of the idea that the government would tax their income. Cuban on the island I found to be terribly libertarian. Maybe that's a good thing around here at the McCain Institute. But, you know, highly allergic to the idea of taxes. So the government has gone sort of up and down in its taxation of these casas particulares. Too high tax, not enough tax. They're, you know, and it's not an evenly functioning system. But what we do see in Cuba are, and you can look at this online and rent them out now and book them now, is private families renting out their homes to people that are coming in from all over the world. And it's growing and growing and growing. And I think pretty soon, you know, we'll see Airbnb on the island.
Sir, you have a question right over here.
David Kramer with the McCain Institute. I have a question about both timing and process. Could you explain why after all these years, last December suddenly became the time to do this? I've heard it was Alan Gross actually delayed the change. I've heard Alan Gross's condition accelerated the change. I heard after the midterm the president felt he could go ahead and do this. What was magic about December 17th that led to this change? And then what about the process where essentially Congress was completely cut out of it? Thank you.
Do you want me to take that?
Sure. Why don't you start with this, Julia?
Well, let's see. December 17th was Pope Francisco's birthday. So I guess given the Vatican's mediation on this one, the Cuban and the U.S. government decided to give him a birthday present. I'm speculating. Oh, well, but were you involved in okay, so there you go. Sorry. It was also the first night of Hanukkah and San Lázaro. I don't know. I mean, the date isn't the issue, but the Alan Gross issue had for some time been quite vexing. In the first term, this is my understanding of the Obama administration, attempted to find some way to get the Cuban government to release Gross, from my sense, making a bunch of unilateral demands, and the Cuban government just waited it out until the Cuban government was able to put the Cuban 5 and then the Cuban 3 onto the negotiating table. In the second term, when you have a president that's looking for legacy, and a region, Latin America, in which Cuba is, sorry to use the expression, low-hanging fruit in terms of the diplomatic upside of a Cuba move, the issue of gross, the issue of realizing that there was a diplomatic framework and possible win for the administration, all came together in the second term. And then there's another piece of it which has to do with the politics in the country and the demographics and public opinion and the fact that, oh, Charlie Crist lost in the state of Florida, but he won the Cuban American vote. Cuban American opinion, public opinion, and also the second half of the second term, plus the regional dynamics, I think, helped the stars to align.
There's two facts here that needs to be corrected. First of all, Charlie Crist did not win the Cuban American vote in Florida. If you look at there's an exit poll that was taken, and it said that they basically tied it. Their sins have been done. If you go precinct by precinct in Miami-Dade County, in the most Cuban American precincts, Charlie Crist lost, and in some cases didn't even break 30-35%. And Rick Scott himself will tell you today that the reason he is governor is because Charlie Crist used Cuba as an issue and because he got it handed to him in the Cuban American community. That is a fact, and the facts are all in there. But I think what's important here from a perspective in this regards is that I'm sorry, what was the original?
What was the question?
Yeah, I got because it's political. I was like fascinated by it.
Let me reset. The question was why essentially did the president?
Oh, sorry. That was the other fact. I'm sorry because I got so excited. So the reason why they chose December 17th, with all due respect to Pope Francisco, it had nothing to do with him. It was because the administration was waiting for Congress to leave town. As you recall, it was during the Cromnibus, and they were actually waiting till the Friday before to make the announcement. They didn't want the political blowback from Congress. They were having everything ready, and then with the Cromnibus and due to some maneuvering that got it through the weekend, and I'm sure Senator McCain recalls that weekend after, they waited till that was resolved on that Tuesday, waited for Congress to leave town so they could do so and get as little political blowback as possible before the president got on a plane and went to Hawaii for his vacation. If you follow every Cuban announcement they've made in 2009, 2011, etc., they always do it on a Friday afternoon on the weekend of a holiday before they cut out of town in order to minimize political blowback. Anybody that's involved in government PR knows that that is a very a mechanism they like to use. My apologies for my lapse of memory.
Except it was a Wednesday. December 17th was a Wednesday.
That's right. They waited, and Congress left town on Tuesday.
I thought you said they
December
announced
16th.
it on a Friday.
No, they were supposed to leave on a Friday. They were supposed to leave on. That was when they were going to do it.
Got it.
That was when they were going to do it, and they moved forward.
Okay, let's.
So
only one.
let me go back to the timing issue.
Before we do that, why don't we take a question right here in the audience? Right here, this gentleman. Thank you. Right here, this gentleman in the middle. Sir, I was pointing at him. Oh, we'll get to you. We'll get to you. Don't worry about that.
There's a woman in the front. There's a woman in the front.
Thank you. My question is for Jody and for Julia, and it regards civil society in Cuba. Sure. As you know, groups in civil society, such as the Ladies in White, even since the policy announcement in December, they continue to be harassed by the regime. These are women whose husbands, whose brothers, whose sons are in jail for political reasons. And what they do is on Sundays they go out and they walk and they march peacefully dressed in white. And they've continued to be harassed, spat upon, arrested, and this has continued in January and in February. My question is, shouldn't the administration have attempted to at least obtain perhaps some sort of public commitment to leave these civil society groups to express themselves? That was not done. And what kind of message does that send to those women, to anybody else who's trying to stand up for freedom, for an advancement towards democracy, if they're completely ignored? That's it.
Let me just say that some of the recent events that have transpired didn't perfect the regime. They simply enabled the opportunity for us to engage. And they enabled the opportunity for the impediment for the means of communication the Castro government was having with their own people. That America was the reason for scarcity on the island. You removed that impediment. So we have had varying stories of what the human rights conditions are on the ground from our partners, from our allies, and those numbers come and go. I think that we've actually been given the opportunity to no longer be the excuse on the island for scarcity. And Julia, that's when I turn it to you.
Well, I would like to see American civil society connect to Cuban civil society. I frankly don't have a lot of faith in our two governments doing more than getting out of the way. After 50 years of incredible skepticism and mutual distrust, you know, I understand your question, but on the human rights issue, what I would do is talk to you about Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, other organizations who have essentially come down on this issue and said, the better part of valor is on the matter of rich and free civil society and a human rights context that we can be proud of, engagement and advancing our own open society values through the front door and through connecting our two societies is the way forward.
Mauricio and Orlando, I'd like to get your thoughts on this question.
I'll go real quickly in the sense that, I mean, you have a Nobel Prize winner, Liu Xiaobo, who is in prison in China, and essentially the world is silent in his regards. Why? Because we don't want to disrupt our business with China. When the Hong Kong students were out on the street, you had the big 5 accounting firms put out ads in the newspapers in Hong Kong and China saying, hey, let's not support them, we stand on the side of the regime, we don't want to disrupt that business situation. I would love to be in a world, you know, if in fact, and I might be wrong, and please, I hope I'm wrong, you know, if the Chamber of Commerce tomorrow is going to come out and then lobby for when those people are arrested in Cuba and advocate for their freedom, if they're going to advocate for the freedom of the people in Venezuela and those things, if they're going to, but if what the example is going to be the silence that we're facing today in Venezuela, the silence that we face in China, if that is the model, the Cuban civil society, the Cuban dissidents, our Havels, our Valeses, our Sushis, etc., our Mandelas, they've lost.
Very, very simply, repression in Cuba is constitutional. The government does not repress because it's repressive. It's repressed because it needs governance. In order to get an understanding with the United States, to get an engagement, we need hostages, we need prisoners. So at some point, if we don't have enough political prisoners, as it happened after 2010, we need to catch them and release. It's like a procedure. The 53 political prisoners that were released meant nothing in terms of advancement of political freedom in Cuba. That simply implies that they were catch on purpose for minor crimes, common crimes, most of the cases, in order to release it to the President Obama to give some opportunity for the New York Times to talk about, for the Chamber of Commerce, and to advance the engagement at the desired time. The same happened to Alan Gross. He's on operation from the state security right from the beginning. He traveled several times to Cuba. He could have been kicked out from the country, as many Americans, but he was let him to work on purpose, in my opinion, not only for this swap with the spies that has no importance for the Cuban regimes. The spies mean nothing, as any human beings mean nothing to them, but in order to make sure that the engagement will not touch political sphere. USAID is banned for the ages in Cuba. We can get engagement, we can swap credit cards in Cuba, but we will not talk about politics, engagement, or a public institution like the USAID and other NGOs to establish their agencies in Cuba to work. That's not possible because we have the sad experience of what happened to Alan Gross and his teeth and his sad family separated for years, and what happened then that's the message. After that point, Americans are not allowed anymore to do pro-democracy activities in Cuba. So this is part of the agenda, and the agenda is respected from both sides, USA and Cuba.
We have a question from this young lady right here in the front.
So really quickly, actually, Brazil for the first time condemned Venezuela,
Yes,
which is very new for them because they've never spoken out, which, you know, correlation does not mean causation, but perhaps the Cuba policy opening had something to do with that. I don't know. But my question is, you know, what do you make of the fact, for the gentleman, what do you make of the fact that, you know, 188 countries in, you know, voting in the UN have voted against this policy, at least definitely this year, but for the past 22 years? How do you, you know, if the United States is trying to be a global player, if they're trying to work in a globalized world, what do you make of the fact that we are an island on this issue? Or is that okay?
And by the 188, you're referring to the UN?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, well,
Israel is the only one that votes with us every year. So.
Well, a similar amount of countries voted to include Venezuela's repressive regime in the UN Security Council. So at the end of the day, they make bad decisions, and as many number of countries condemn Israel all the time. So those many number of countries in the UN make lots of mistakes in their policies in that regards. But that's why we don't lead from behind. We don't lead in the sense, and the way I view the United States, we don't lead in the sense of what the rest of the world's doing. We've seen what, as the gentleman mentioned, what Europe has done in Cuba, what Canada has done in Cuba, what the other Latin American countries have done in Cuba. In other words, do nothing to help the Cuban people, but only help the regime. And that's not what we should be doing. That's not what we do. At the end of the day, we are the world's leader. We lead by example. As I said before, Cubans love Americans for a reason, because they perceive we've been on their side. You know, that's just a reality. Don't change that. And actually, my 15 seconds. Look, there's a really famous example here during the Cold War. You know, you had Coke and Pepsi. You know, Pepsi did business with the Soviet Union since the 70s. They were cutting deals with the Soviet Union since the late 60s and 70s, trying to get in. Hey, I want to get in there first. Coca-Cola, and I'd like to attribute that to the fact that there was a Cuban-American chairman at the time, said, Roberto Goizueta, did not want to. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and when business in Eastern Europe began, then Coca-Cola went in there. And guess what? In less than a year, Coca-Cola sales just skyrocketed past, and then at the end, when the Soviet Union crumbled, skyrocketed past Pepsi-Colas, and Pepsi-Colas never even gotten anywhere near. Why? Because Eastern Europeans and Russians at the time equated Coca-Cola with freedom. Getting your foot in there in the 60s and 70s, cutting deals with these guys, it sends the wrong message. Actually, you're going to send a rejected message from the Cuban people, and the proof has been in the pudding, is what we see in Eastern Europe. That's the case study, which I think Harvard should do a business study.
Jody, I have to get you to weigh in on that, you know, being the person from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Every day, Pepsi and Coca-Cola want us to pick between them.
Yeah.
You know, the fact of the matter is we have 3 million member companies. That's a lot of cats to herd. And over the past several years, I've had a lot of members of the Cuban-American business community calling us in the South Florida area. You know, I have not had a single business who has been in favor of the embargo. That's called us, and mainly because of the leadership position. It puts our companies leading from behind. I would actually argue that this was leadership in making a decision because things were getting stale, and the Soviet way of being had not introduced some new thoughts into Cuban society. I think that there's a lot of intellectual capital that could be tapped into among the Cuban people. And the excuse that's been used by the Cuban regime to oppress its own people has been the fact that the embargo's been in place. So, you mentioned that Brazil weighed in. On Tuesday, they did. You know, Venezuela is a friend, an ally, and a trading partner with Brazil. But on Tuesday, the Foreign Ministry, Itamaraty, weighed in that the actions of Maduro were wrong. I think that we're at a moment in time where we needed to introduce some new thinking. And I think that our businesses believe that if there's an opportunity to train people, entrepreneurs, use the intellectual capital that still we believe is available on the ground in Cuba, that will go a long way to help the Cuban people.
This gentleman right
Can I make a quick distinction, though? Because it's something really important.
Let me just go to another question, okay? Please, because you can go back and forth all day on this,
Sure.
absolutely. Right here, this gentleman.
My name's Brad Denny. I am a student studying abroad this semester. And my question is to Mr. Carone and Mr. Lazo. Besides normalizing ties with Cuba, what other tools does the United States have to hasten the fall of the regime of Fidel Castro? And also, does it benefit the United States to isolate ourselves from certain Latin American countries who are opposed to our embargo of Cuba?
There is the law in the United States to help democracy and freedom and economy and free markets and chambers of commerce in Cuba, billions and billions and investments and sugarcane mills to restore the industry that was destroyed. It's in the law. It's stipulated by the law. Only that the law has some points that claim, very briefly point, that the president can go to the Congress and say, okay, we can banish the embargo because, as Julia has been mentioned here, the embargo is in place still. That law is called Liberty Act and Democracy. All these laws stipulate that only when the government makes the masquerade of a democratic system, the masquerade in a way, trying to create like maybe a false opposition in the national parliament, the president can come to the Congress and say, today is December 17th, this is it. All travel restriction, all economical sanctions, you can go and invest freely. But that hasn't happened, it's in the law. So that's the mechanism. The other mechanism would be physical pressure, no? And nobody's talking about that in this point. No? So it's stipulated in the law, is there, only that the president what is happening somehow, and I'm not especially against this measure, is that he's saying, no, we don't need to wait for those democratization to happen in the Cuban people because they will never happen. They are not civil actors in Cuba. We need to trade with the bad guys for a while, maybe because I trust in the spirit of freedom in America. In the near future, in the long future, in the next 50 or 25 years, the things will be much more democratic. And also there is a distrust in democracy. We Cubans during 59 years were democrats, and somehow there is the perception, an international perception, that our democracy, like many Latin American democracy, was a fake and that we were corrupt. We were not enough democrats as this great nation. So there is also a little of racism because Cubans have this belief of being dictators and a strong man. Machado, Batista, and all Fidel Castro.
Thank you. A response? Julia.
Well, I wanted to hear Mauricio's response to the gentleman's question, but what I was asking to jump in on earlier just had to do with something Orlando said previously. You know, actually quite pointedly, the talks that took place in December, since December, were very clearly, from the U.S. side, insistent on continuing the democracy promotion programs. The United States has not said that it's going to stop those programs, even though those were the programs under which Alan Gross was there. In fact, it said that it intends to continue them.
I recognize that they will never say that. They will just stop it. They will not say it.
That's because it's written in law. So
well, they haven't stopped. I mean, they haven't stopped. The RFPs are there. They're quite accurate.
Then we need more transparency. We need to know which are the actors receiving that help in Cuba, and if they are going to be put in jail or not, if they are mercenary or not of the Americans. So we will need a normalization of the pro-democracy help in Cuba and of the funds, the millions that could be put into Cuba to promote democracy, not to create social unrest, but to promote democracy. And what the Cuban government is doing is taking like a very simple way of sending text message as a subversive weapon. And so, in my opinion, ultimately what will happen is that USAID and all the organizations that we know very well here in Washington, D.C., except those NGOs like the Center for Democracy in America that work with a pro-Castro agenda, they will keep their work, but others will be eventually prevented. Although the president...
So the programs...
Julia, at this point...
Okay, sorry.
It's all right. I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk right now. It's an opportunity for each of our panelists to sort of give a policy prescription going forward, now that this executive action has been made by the president. What, in your view, should be done going forward? And I'll start with you, Julia, and we'll go all the way down.
Oh, I'd like to have the last word.
You get the first word. Go ahead, Julia.
You got to try.
Ladies first.
Well, I believe strongly that the approach that has been started needs to continue. It is going to be slow going. I don't know if we'll have flags raised over the embassies by the time of the Summit of the Americas, but the process needs to continue. We need to very quickly put together a number of bilateral, this is going to sound wonky, but a number of bilateral working groups so that the agencies and the executive branches of both governments can start talking to one another and figuring out how they're going to connect on human trafficking, on drug trafficking, not just bilaterally, but in the Caribbean basin as a whole, on environmental issues, on managing the flow of people back and forth, the whole range of issues that countries deal with on one another, all of that needs to get launched and needs to continue. And beyond that, I would say there is a role for Congress. I didn't answer your question about Congress, but here I would say I think we can guess why it was that this was rolled out without congressional consultation. But now going forward, there are 3 pieces of legislation, there may be more, that are going to, if not, they will address pieces of the deeper puzzle, which has to do with lifting the travel ban, with a telecommunications bill, with repealing, if not all of Helms-Burton, certainly big chunks of the fundamentals of the embargo. And that's a debate that's going to happen in the United States as a whole and in the U.S. Congress. And that is why, to the question of transparency, more and more Americans ought to go to Cuba, and they ought to come back and participate in that debate. And that's what I think ought to continue over the next however long it takes.
Jody.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I think the basics of it are this. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been against the sanctions, against the embargo for quite some time. And in this case, we believe that the failed policy of over half a century needed the chance to be relooked at. Why? We've built up this dense network of countries that we're trading with in this hemisphere and that have done very well economically because of their relationship with the United States. But there's this glaring exception, and it's just 90 miles off our shore. Geography. We need to be looking at doing something different when the former policy didn't work. And the fact of the matter is, on principle, what guides our vision is that free enterprise, the first word being free, has the opportunity to transform societies when we have the ability to engage. Up until now, we have been unable to actually train entrepreneurs, work with entrepreneurs on the island, or act as ambassadors of the United States for change among the Cuban people. And that's what this opening entails.
Mauricio.
At the 2001 Quebec Summit, the Summit of the Americas process, it was agreed to by 34 out of 35 countries in the Western Hemisphere that democracy was a key to the summit process. It was a key condition to the summit process. The Obama administration has now decided that we're going to break that 2001 commitment to democracy by now allowing Cuba, the sole dictatorship, the sole holdout, into this summit process and to break that key commitment to democracy. Once you break that spigot open, I'm not sure we're going to be able to close it again. I think that's a huge service to our hemispheric policy overall. If the goal here of the Chamber and others is essentially to train and to educate Cubans and Cuban entrepreneurs, as we've heard over and over again, that's great. And there's nothing in the law that has, frankly, ever prohibited that. So we're having kind of another conversation. Now, if the goal is what people are advocating for, which is to allow U.S. businesses to go in there under the rules of the game of the Castro regime, which is as minority partners of the Castro regime, which is of having the Castro regime have to hire workers directly, not allowing them to freely hire who they want in violation of every International Labor Organization convention, of keeping 92% of every dollar that they pay in those investments. If the conditions are those conditions that violate all international accords, then if that's what we're seeking, then obviously I'm against that. What we're seeking is frankly what has worked and what has led democratic transitions everywhere else in the world. Support the game changers. Support those advocates. And I know I sound like a broken record here, but they're my heroes. You know, the Havels, the Valdezes, the Mandelas, the Sushis. Those are game changers. None of those, you know, they were a poet, a labor leader, you know, a political activist, etc. None of them were, working in a chinchalito, which is a kind of a small stand or, entrepreneur or anything of the sort. That's just the fact, So let's support the game changers, the future leaders. U.S. policy has essentially said this. We're going to hold the billions and billions of dollars that entails trade, investment, and tourism, and we're going to save it for the Cuban people. What we're advocating now by prematurely lifting that is to say we're going to have those billions, that trust, we're going to hand it over to the monopolies of the Castro brothers. I have never known in history or in business or anywhere else where a monopoly is broken by doing more business with a monopoly. If so, this would be the United States of Rockefeller. Unfortunately, there's no antitrust laws in Cuba. You don't break a monopoly by doing more business. You don't break a mafia by doing more business with it. Unfortunately, you need to have certain consequences in that regards. So let's support the good guys, stand by them, and not reward their oppressors. That's the way forward, and history has proven that.
Thank you. And Orlando?
And very briefly, I think that, in fact, free markets need free people. It's not possible to other way. Anyway, if investment in Cuba is not considered interference, and there are many goodwill Americans into this move, then why, what I'm requesting is make it political also. Political interference, as the Cuban government call it, should not be criminalized, should not be considered interference. The diffusion, the spread of the freedom of thought and freedom of what a society like United States is within Cuba is important for us. It's not only important for us to know what the Coca-Cola tastes like or about the new jobs that could be created in Cuba with investment, but also something that has to do with moral values. The perception that a totalitarian system, that a system that has 1/5 of its population elsewhere is not the normal system. And so the normalization with this abnormal system can move, maybe it's strategically to move forward now. I could be working in either scenario, but keeping in mind that the purpose is political. We want a political change in Cuba, not an economical change in Cuba, because we don't want solvency. We want a society where Cubans doesn't need to migrate generation after generation.
Thank you. Orlando, thank you all for coming out. It was bad weather this morning. It ended up being a nice day after all. It's an informative debate, as all debates here are at the McCain Institute. Thank you to Ambassador Volker. Thank you to Senator McCain, who managed to make it over here. Thank you for your service to our country. And again, thanks a lot for showing up for this very informative debate. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. And let me ask you if you would give one more round of applause. Thank you to each of our debaters. This is the most educated, informative, thoughtful debate about Cuba policy that I think I've heard, and I think that we've all been treated to something very rare. And also thank you to John Decker, who did a great job moderating.
Yay, John. Thanks, John.
Thank you, and follow us at McCainInstitute.org.